Hello, welcome to video number 14 in our series, Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. The content exam focus is 70-515. The content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP, .NET Videos.net. So video number 14, we're going to cover some debugging and error handling techniques. This is one of the exam fundamentals. This is a very large topic, deserving of its own video series, in fact, but we'll be covering some core fundamentals you're going to need to know for the exam, as well as just being a professional 4.0 developer. The global.asax file is where we can use application-wide events. So this is an app-wide thing scoped at that level. We'll look at where the error handling comes in with that file. Using custom errors in the web config, we can redirect our users to a friendly error page, which is a common and appropriate technique to do, not showing our users the nitty-gritty details of the error, so to speak. We're going to talk about handled versus unhandled exceptions. So exceptions that we can do something about in our applications, we should handle those. We'll look at how we do that with using try-catch or the using clause. And what to do when we have unhandled exceptions, we'll talk about that as well. So the try-catch finally, or the using clause, gives us the ability to wrap our logic that may be error-prone and catch exceptions that may occur. And again, we should just be catching exceptions that we can do something about. We'll look at that in some depth there. Debugging itself, we're going to use just some basic debugging steps in this video. There's a large amount of debugging tools and features built into Visual Studio that we won't be covering. You can check back for supplemental videos on some of this stuff, but you can do JavaScript debugging. You can debug, enable remote debugging and debug things on like your demo servers. There's several techniques for using trace points and new features like IntelliTrace built into Visual Studio 2010. We've already looked at tracing a bit in earlier videos. So let's go ahead and jump into the image and start to explore some of these techniques. I'm just going to add a global.asax file. Now this file can be used for application-wide or global events that happen. So if I go ahead and just add this file into my application, you'll see that it shows up there. If you look at the code behind here, you've got application start, session start, begin request. One of the things we're going to look at in a moment is you can actually catch a centralized spot here where you can catch all application errors that are unhandled. We'll go ahead and I'll just add some, you might add some type of a code here. I'm just going to add a comment, but let's say on the application start. This is going to happen when the application first starts. So you might be setting some application-wide state or variables at this place. The session, if you wanted, this is for every individual session. This event will fire. So these are global type events that fire that are built in here for you, and you could certainly plug into these and use these. For this particular scope for this video, we're going to be talking about this application underscore error down here, but you could certainly set breakpoints in these various events and find out where they fire. For example, when I just run this application the first time, there's no code involved at all, but this event will fire, application start, and it will fire one time only. It's just when the application gets started up. And then you see that the session that's starting itself, if we're going to be using some type of a session state and you're wanting to do some type of, set some initialized variables, etc., you could do that here. That's per individual session. You see as I hit the refresh button here, I'm not actually dropping into either of those methods at this point. They just happen the one time for my session, one time when the application starts. So if you need granular control of these type of events, you want to think about the global.asax file. Now for this particular video, what I want to kind of concentrate on and look at will be the application error. And you'll notice that we have this application end here as well that you might use to do some cleanup or something like this. The application error underscore error method here is a great place to log or perhaps put some details about an unhandled exception that your application has. So what I mean by that is if I go and I look at, I've got a simple button here and I've got a label and I'm just purposely throwing an exception. Your applications, no matter how perfect they are, they're likely to throw exceptions from time to time. And you'll notice when I go ahead and run this, I can remove the breakpoints here from the global.asax file. And if I click the button, I'm going to purposely throw this HTTP exception. Now imagine a scenario where something else caused the exception. You notice here that if you're in Visual Studio, you get this nice dialog up here saying, say, something caused an exception to be thrown. And at this point, if I keep playing here, you see it does hit the breakpoint application underscore error. So I could be logging details about that error at this point. There are techniques that we could use to do that. Check back for supplemental videos to go in more depth there. But the idea is that we're going to be throwing this exception. Now you see what the user would see on the screen. There's a stack trace information here. Now this is great if I'm doing development and debugging, but this is not good if we want, for our end users. We wouldn't want to show our users that. It's also a security best practice not to do that as well. We're showing too much detail here. It's a nasty looking error page, etc. So we're going to talk about techniques that you'll use to avoid showing your users this in a moment. But you notice here that we're firing into this application error. And again, the fundamental thing to remember, this is the place where you're probably going to want to log any exceptions that you don't handle. We'll talk in a moment about exceptions that you can handle, the ones that you could do something about, and how that looks with like try catch finally. So if you see here, in this button process click, we're purposely throwing this exception. I'm going to wrap this in what's called a try catch. And notice it just put the word try there. And if you're familiar with this already, I'm just putting a clause here. I'm going to go ahead and catch. And I'm going to catch the general system.exception. We know we're going to throw HTTP exception. I'm actually catching just system.exception. Now this is not what you'd want to do. I'm going to go ahead and make that clear in my comment here. You would not typically catch general exceptions. You don't know what the exception is. You can't do anything about it. You're just swallowing an exception at this point. So this application code, which is you might see from time to time in developers code, would not be a good thing. You see, we're just catching and swallowing the exception. I'm clicking the process button. The exception is indeed being thrown, but we're not hitting an error. Well, you say, well, that's great. The users don't see it. Well, no, because the program logic may break apart at that point. Imagine that something was supposed to happen on that process button. That exception's being thrown. We're in effect just catching this. And notice that the global.asex files is never being touched either. So we're not logging the details of that exception. We're simply swallowing at this point. So this is no good. We want to be logging what happened. We don't want the application most likely to continue if an exception happened that we can't do something about. Something may degrade or break down. So let's look at something that we should do. So let's say I have a file not found exception here, and I'm going to catch that. Let's say that I could then redirect my users to create a file. I might be able to do something about that, or prompt them to maybe to create the file, or have something else happen. So the example here is I've just got some comments I'm using for the sake of the demo to be quick. But the idea is I can do something about this exception, so I'll handle it and then perhaps again have something happen in my application where we can recover. I still can't do anything about the HTTP exception, so I'm not catching that general exception anymore. At this point, I'm only wanting to catch exceptions I can do something about, and that's the best practice for your exception handling. You shouldn't catch general exceptions. So at this point, when we go ahead and run the application, we click the process button, and we never hit inside the catch because we're not hitting the file not found exception, so you won't go any further than that, just that catch statement. We are hitting the application underscore error at this point because we still did throw the HTTP exception, and now we see the ugly page. So, we're not swallowing the exception, at least at this point. The application is not going to continue and give us like corrupt data or something like this, so that's good. But we've got to do something about that nasty error page, which we'll show in a minute. So we're getting closer to being the best practice here. I'm going to also introduce what's called the finally clause. Now the finally clause, the try catch finally, and the finally clause is guaranteed to execute. This makes this a great place to like clean up database connections. No matter what happens, if an exception is thrown or not, we can close the database connection. So it's a common thing, or close like some type of object like a data reader that might be holding on to a database connection. So the finally clause is guaranteed to execute, so it's very common to see like a try catch finally. You could substitute a using clause, which we won't be covering in this video, to do the same thing. But the idea is, I'm just going to put a couple pieces of logic here, set the labels text property, which we won't actually even hit, but just so I can kind of walk through the process here. So okay, we throw the exception, we hit the catch statement, we're never going to hit that label, but we will hit the label in the finally clause. This is getting executed. So again, versus setting a label or doing something, we might be logging the error there. We might be more likely cleaning up objects, this type of stuff. Notice we do hit the application error, but we still have the ugly error page. So what we want to do is in the web config itself, there is an element called custom errors, and you can set the default redirect to your friendly error page. Now this is some type of central spot where you might pass details about the error and log them. But at the same time, you want to show your users hey, something happened in the application. We apologize for the error. It's being looked at, this type of thing. We don't want to show the users that ugly error. We certainly don't want to swallow the exception, but at the same time, we don't want to show the users the ugly error. So you see, I didn't change any application logic here. We hit the catch statement there. We don't drop into the catch statement. And at this point, we hit the finally clause. It does execute even though we've thrown an exception up above it. And at this point, application underscore error does fire. But the web config setting is driving us to this friendly error page, which is great. Now there are no details, there are no stack trace information here. Our users don't see this. If we have a hacker or something like that using our application, he's not getting any nitty-gritty details about what went on. So this is what we want to do. We want to be basically redirecting to a friendly error page. You shouldn't be catching general exceptions and swallowing them, which may degrade your application, as we know. So those basic techniques are the fundamentals you need to work with when working with exception handling and error handling. In further videos, we would talk about doing some advanced debugging, this type of stuff. So check back for supplemental videos around this topic. Now before we wrap up, I want to go over one more technique. I actually have a new .NET project up here I want to show you. I've just got a button here that simply throws an error up. Automatically throws an unhandled exception. I don't have any logic here handling of this at this point. Just to demonstrate, you might want to catch the error, log it to a database, or actually display it on a web page. So just when I click this, I go ahead and do DL is not found. You get all this error ugly mess here. But what we can do is come into the global.asax file and actually grab that exception. There's a little bit of a technique here you're going to want to use. And you grab this exception that's unhandled. I'll uncomment my code here. And at this point, either log it to a database. You could redirect to another error page that will show some details. And again, you wouldn't want to show your end users error details as a security best practice, but like if you're debugging or troubleshooting, notice I'm just basically saying system.exception, the name of the unhandled error is unhandled error, just an arbitrary name, and I'm saying get last error, server get last error, and I'm just choosing to stuff that into a session variable here, and then I can call server.clear and then simply response.redirect over to an error details page at this point. So I'm just clearing the error out from the server object. I've already got it in session at that point. I'm just redirecting over to an error details page. All I'm doing over here is checking to make sure it's not null, that session variable. If it isn't, I'm just going to response.write it out to the screen. Again, you probably want to be logging this to a database, to a file, something like this. You wouldn't have to display it on a web form. Don't show your users, your customers, so to speak, errors on a web form for security best practice. But as a troubleshooter or if you're a developer and you want this error detail, and again, you probably want to format this. You could certainly have this data being shoved into a database somewhere, and so you might, for a technique, actually shove this into a database or a file somewhere just to log the issue, and then perhaps redirect your end users off into a friendly error page that we already looked at.